But I'm very pleased to welcome you here for this panel discussion focusing on the Centennial passage of the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Today marks the 100th year since Governor Elbert Lee Trinkle signed what was officially known as the Act to Preserve Racial Integrity. The legislation was designed to stop intermarriage of white and black people in Virginia. The act banned interracial marriage by requiring applicants to identify their race and define a white person as one who, and I quote, had no trace of blood any other than Caucasian. However, this legislation impacted the entire citizenry of the Commonwealth of Virginia, especially Virginia's Indigenous communities. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Gregory Smithers. Dr. Smithers is professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University. His research focuses on Native American and environmental history, and his most recent work, published by Beacon Press in 2022, is Reclaiming Two Spirits: Sexuality, Spiritual Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America. So please welcome Dr. Smithers to the podium.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here this evening. Let me also extend my thanks to the Library of Virginia for hosting this event, and a special shout out to Ashley Ramey Craig, who's been instrumental in putting all of this programming together. We're very proud of Ashley at VCU. She's one of our most successful and now famous graduates. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce our panelists. I'm quite honored to be on stage with them all. Standing backstage and listening to them share stories was quite special in and of itself. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to briefly discuss or provide a brief overview of the Racial Integrity Act before moving into our discussion. And then I'll open it up to you all for questions and comments. I do ask, before I forget, that you keep your questions succinct and on point so that we can get to as many of your questions as possible in the time that we have. So firstly, let me introduce Lynette Alston not quite the middle there, but Lynette Alston is the chief of the Nottoway Indian tribe in Virginia, one of 11 tribes officially recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia. The primary focus of the Nottoway Indian tribe of Virginia has been to offer educational and outreach opportunities to close the gaps that exist in understanding the history and culture of the Nottoway Indians. She's the co-author of the book entitled Du Tratang, which offers a compelling look at the history, culture, and lifestyle of the Nottoway Indians. Alston returned to her childhood home in Druryville, Virginia, after a career as a small business owner and community leader for various organizations in Columbia, South Carolina. She's busy. She currently serves as the president of the board of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia, is president of the board of Rawls Museum Arts in Cortland, Virginia, is a member of the board of Virginia Humanities, and is a commissioner on the Southampton County Virginia Planning Commission. I told you she was busy. She enjoys spending whatever free time she has, I don't know where she gets this free time, with her family, especially her grandchildren, and her favorite hobby is pottery making. And I should also point out that Chief Alston came and visited one of my classes several years ago. That was a transformative experience for many of those students who changed their majors to history majors thanks to Chief Alston. And thanks to Chief Alston, I got really good teaching evaluations that semester. Wayne Adkins. There we are. Wayne Adkins has been a member of the Chickahominy Tribal Council since 1996 and has served as first assistant chief since June of 2011. Wayne served as the president of the Virginia Indian Tribal Alliance for Life, or VITAL. the organization that was instrumental in gaining federal government recognition of 6 Virginia tribes through congressional legislation back in 2018. It feels like just yesterday. In addition to his duties in the tribal government, Wayne is also employed as the finance officer for the Chickahominy Indian tribe, with responsibility for accounting, purchasing, payroll, and property management. Wayne, it's a delight to meet you. Lou Ratchford. Lou? Is the assistant chief of the Upper Mattaponi tribe in King William County, Virginia. She attended the Sharon Indian School, or SIS, through the 11th grade, which was the highest grade that the Sharon Indian School went to. To acquire a high school diploma, Lou attended Oak Hill Academy in Mount Wilson, Virginia. After high school, Lou acquired her first job with Baptist Bookstore. In the intervening years, she has been fortunate to work with entities in which she was afforded multiple opportunities, culminating in being elected the 3rd Assistant Chief of the Upper Mattaponi tribe. And Robert Gray down the ends. Robert Gray is the chief of the Pamunkey Indian tribe, a position he has held since 2015. Prior to that, he served as assistant chief for 6 years and as tribal council person for more than 20 years. Chief Gray is also a retired United States Air Force Chief Master Sergeant with 32 years of military experience. Chief Gray. It's a very esteemed and accomplished panel, as you can see, so it really is my honor to be here. Let me introduce our discussion by starting just a couple blocks up that way. Actually, the corner of Broad and 7th Street in the summer of 1923. Actually, it was June 1923. A very strange, sort of thin, intense-looking, fairly tall man was standing at the corner of Broad and 7th, and he was standing with a notepad, not unlike this, with a pencil, and he was taking note of who walked past him on their way to work. The man in question was John Powell, a pianist and composer, and one of the co-founders of the Anglo-Saxon clubs here in Virginia. What Powell was doing that balmy summer morning was annotating what he thought the racial characteristics of everyone walking past that intersection was. And his methodology, as questionable as it may have been, convinced him further that Virginia was part of a global problem, the rising tide of color, mixed-race people, increasing their population throughout Virginia, the United States, and globally. Something must be done about this. Powell, Ernest Cox, the other co-founder of the Anglo-Saxon clubs, and Walter Plecker, among others, who we'll no doubt talk about this evening. The world was changing, and these white men didn't like it. And no one, moreover, was taking the threat that Powell could see just a few blocks up from us before his very eyes. And so they're lobbying to try and do something about this threat of a rising tide of color was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a century old today. The Racial Integrity Act made it a felony to racially identify on birth, death, or marriage certificates in a way that was not in keeping with your actual racial identity. The Racial Integrity Act banned marriage between white and non-white people, something that was not overturned until 1967, of course, in the Loving case. Both offenses carried a 1-year jail sentence. The exception, which troubled so many white supremacists who were normal Virginians in 1924, was the Pocahontas Clause. A piece of clause in this legislation that we may talk about this evening that said if you had 1/16 or less native blood, you qualified as white. The man in charge of policing these racial categories and boundaries was, as I alluded to a second ago, Walter Plecker, the director of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. You can learn much more about Plecker and the Racial Integrity Act. Ashley Ramey Craig has an excellent blog piece on the Commonwealth blog, the Library of Virginia's blog, and she also co-authored a piece with me that was out this morning in the Made by History section of Time magazine. This period in Virginia history and American history more broadly had, as we'll discuss momentarily, an enduring impact, a legacy on Native American people. Walter Plecker and his staff at the Bureau of Vital Statistics went out of their way to persecute people claiming to be Native American. In fact, it got so bad at one point in the late 1920s and early 1930s that several of the churches began to raise objections to Plecker's work. Just to give you one example, the Dover Baptist Association issued a statement in which they said that the Bureau has to stop these recurring attempts to humiliate the Pamunkey, Mattaponi, and Chickahominy people. These threats and innuendos and accusations of mixed race identities, people passing as white and Native American, these traveled through time and into the late 20th century and have an enduring impact on the way many people view Virginia history. And it's that we'll talk about this evening. Okay, so I wanted to begin by getting you all to firstly reflect on some of the stories that people told growing up, grandparents, parents, their memories of the Racial Integrity Act and how people responded, how they altered their behavior, warnings that they might have offered young people to protect themselves. Lou, do you want to start us off?
Sure. One thing that I noticed growing up is that we did not go very many places other than where other Indians went. We would go to our Indian school, our Indian church. We would visit other of the tribal churches, and would visit with them, made friends with them, lifelong friends. But we never went very many places outside of that. And I used to wonder about that growing up because we didn't go very many places. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that because of the Racial Integrity Act and the way that it impacted our tribes, is that we pretty much kind of went inward among ourselves because we got to the point that we could only trust our tribe and the other tribes to treat us fairly. And it had a lot of an impact on us. As you notice in my bio, I said that I only went to our school only had the 11th grade. And I traveled to 300 miles away from my home to get a high school education. And others in my family, my older brothers and sisters, my older brother, for example, he got on a train in Richmond and he traveled to Bacone College in Oklahoma to get a high school education. I had a sister that also traveled to another tribe and lived with someone there because at the time our school only had the 7th grade and the Chickahominy tribe had the 8th grade, and she attended school there for a year. And then after that, then she went to Bacone College. And we were young kids when we had to travel away from home like that. And then when my older brother, when he graduated from high school, he continued at Bacone College and got a 2-year degree. And then he came back to Virginia, and he looked for a job and looked for a job. And the only kind of jobs he was offered were very menial jobs. And so he joined the military. And that's what a lot of Eyre tribal citizens did back in those days. They joined the military. And I suppose they felt accepted in the military. And there was a lot of things that happened. One of my oldest sisters would tell me that she can remember going places. She's about 10 years older than I am. And she said she can remember going places during that time. And it had on the doors white, colored, and in some instances said, "No Indians allowed." I personally don't remember that, but she remembers it very clearly that that happened. And it wasn't until I actually left home that I realized how bad it was.
So your parents sheltered you, in a
Yes,
sense. They protected you.
They protected us, and they sheltered us from that because they knew what we would face when we left home.
Yeah.
And we did face it in a lot of ways. Because like you said, this law stayed on the books until 1967, which was a long time. And we have to face up to it. Some of the impacts of those laws are still with us today. For example, one of the reasons that it took so long for some of our tribes to gain federal recognition was because during the Racial Integrity Act, a lot of our records were destroyed. And so that impacted the ability to go through the process of getting federal recognition. And I know things are a bit different today, but I'm a firm believer in the fact that however much you gain, there's always the risk of losing it. Because our parents had gotten to a place where they were probably, and our grandparents, probably to a place where they were feeling fairly comfortable until that law was passed. And we know that other laws can always be passed to take away that which we have, what we have obtained. And so we have to diligently fight against it, that it does not happen again. And to go add a little bit to that, and some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that even in our time today, as recently as 2023, one of a leader in education in the Department of Education made the comment that Virginia Indians were the first immigrants. So for that statement to be made by someone today lets us know what we have obtained, we can lose. And it can happen so easily because people sometimes will throw whatever they have against the wall until something sticks. And so I would encourage all of our Virginia tribes to work diligently and together to see that it does not happen again. And if we see any inkling of that, is to stand up and be counted. And sometimes we may have to stand up and be counted as not as an individual tribe, but as all of our tribes together.
You know, Lou, you reminded me when you were talking there that the 1924 Act, by the way, was really bad, but the 1934 Racial Integrity Act was even more draconian. It was worse. But what both pieces of legislation did was not only police people's bodies and what they could do with them, but it policed and created this chilling effect on how you were perceived as an Indigenous person in Virginia. And so when I was interested if you encountered that or stories about how people tried to protect their identity as a result of these types of laws and the policing of those laws and all of the innuendo that circulated around the Racial Integrity Act.
I heard lots of stories about that. Most of my stories came through my parents. My grandparents never talked about any of this, but my parents made sure we knew about the Racial Integrity Act. And so we were taught who we are and to be who we are, but also to be careful about being who you are. So we always stood up for ourselves, but we were also very careful because, as Assistant Chief Ratchford said, I never noticed as a child that we only went to certain places, but then as I got older, I realized that we would come to Richmond, we would do our shopping here, but we always kind of stayed to ourselves and we only went to certain places. And at the time, I didn't realize what that was all about until much later. But we have stories of people, for example, most of the people in my tribe were delivered by a midwife up until about the mid-50s or so. And one midwife in particular, whenever she submitted a birth certificate that said Indian on it, she would be rebuked for it to the point that Plucker finally threatened to put her in jail if she didn't stop doing it, because that was, I believe, one of the penalties in the Racial Integrity Act was if you misclassified someone's race, you could be put in jail if you did it intentionally. So we have stories like that of some of our older people having to deal with those kinds of things.
Plucker seemed to really like bullying, and it was. It seemed to be a hobby for him that he took sick joy out of. Lynette, I wonder if you could join the conversation and tell us about your consciousness of, because it's interesting listening to you all as children. You're not fully cognizant. You don't recognize what's going on. Your parents and grandparents are sort of shielding you and protecting you. But when did the awareness emerge for you that, oh, there's something going on here?
Well, I grew up with my grandparents because my parents passed away when my mother died when I was an infant. So my grandfather was probably the most vocal. He his phrases would be, "Do not live too high. We do not live too high. We stay close to home." He was a farmer, and so basically we were self-sufficient. We had gardens and we interacted with people that were around us, and if even with business opportunities, they created a kind of a community of business owners that were all native. They had a little trucking company, and they would deliver fresh fish from Norfolk, and they take them to all the little country stores. But when I looked at all of the men that had the trucks, they were all native men. They were all Nottoway people. So there was a way of getting, that was just a quiet thing that was done. It was a way to keep your community, and but nobody ever spoke of, you did not talk about your ancestors or your heritage or any of that except within the household or with others who were close family friends. So many of our people still lived on land that had once been reservation land. Up until 1870, people still lived on the reservation. We have documents, census records that show Indian on 1870 census, but then on 1880 census, the same families are listed as M, C, W, or B. So Racial Integrity Act, to me, was the culmination of a persistent evolution of trying to deny identity of Virginia's native population. I remember going to dinner one time at a restaurant with my grandfather. He was very reluctant to go. And we were sitting there and the food came and he looked at me and he said, "Do you think there's poison in this?" And, you know, it struck me that this is something he's carried. That's why he did not want to go beyond his community.
Right.
That there's a danger, and he knew the danger. So that's one of the moments, and the place we were in Williamsburg. Of all places, to think that the food would be poisoned.
Right.
You know, that's a memory that stuck with him.
Yeah.
So, and he was born 1898. So, as a child, he experienced some things.
Chief Gray, Robert, can I ask you if you'd share with us some of the sort of reflections that you had growing up and listening to stories from elders about the impacts that the Racial Integrity Act had on the Pamunkey community?
Okay, hearing from tribal elders, how many had to travel out of state to get married, jobs and such. Hearing from other elders that lived off the reservation, they were lucky enough where their birth certificates showed white, and telling their kids, you know, one of them's our assistant chief, don't tell anybody you're Indian, because they were in the white schools down in Norfolk area. So it was that hiding. But I think the biggest thing, my grandparents in the late 20s moved up to Philadelphia along with a lot of Virginia Indians.
Right.
It just wasn't a great place to be in Virginia, jobs and everything else about it. There are communities up there. My mother, my father, Philadelphia, they lived there all of their life. I would say that, you know, we didn't forget the reservation. It was the only place we seemed to come on vacation. Living in Philly, didn't spend much time on the Jersey Shore. We would head south to Virginia. But even before my grandparents eventually retired, they moved back. But those are the type things, and what I think happened with all those people moving, and all those people, as Lou had said, came inward. We lost a lot of cultural, because it was kind of hard to show the culture, because if you show the culture too much, you're identifying yourself and you're drawing attention to yourself. So I don't think, I would say in the, and this is going to what Lynette said, it was starting long before. I see the Racial Integrity Act as the final nail in the coffin. In the early 19th century, white landowners in King William County were petitioning the General Assembly to take away our reservation because they didn't view us as Indian enough.
Right.
Jim Crow laws came along in the late 19th century, and we were fighting to be able to not to have to sit in the back car of the train and just numerous other things. Our tribe established a play group that traveled around the country about our culture that I believe was in answer to the Jim Crow laws, trying to show that we're here. But once the Racial Integrity Act came in, that was about the death of the play group. It just kind of withered on the vine because people were hiding their identity. And we're just, over the last few decades, we're coming out of that mode, but we lost a lot, and we're working with all other tribes. All the tribes are working together to bring that culture back.
Yeah. Well, Robert, you say that a lot was lost, and undoubtedly there was. But how did the fragments, how did the traces of culture and language and just knowledge about tradition and ways of being as a Pamunkey or a Nottoway or Chickahominy, how were those, and I'll open this up to everyone, how were those held on to? Were they spoken about in whispers? Lou, do you have any thoughts on this?
We talked about it in schools, in our school. We would have a few programs. We talked about it in church. We made sure that we stuck together and did not let our identity erode any more than it already had. I can remember one time when I was about 15, 16 years old, and this was during the years when they had the Murphy's and Woolworths on Broad Street, and they used to have lunch counters. Well, we never went to the lunch counters because that was something that we didn't do because we might be rejected there. But this one time, my mother took my sister and me, and we sat at the lunch counter. And there were lots of people around us, and they were getting served, but we weren't. And my mother said, we are going to sit here, if we have to sit here all day until we get served. And we were there for about an hour before we were served, but we were finally served. There are little things like that that stick out in your mind. And like Lynette said, was talking about people moving and all of that, and Chief Gray talking about his family moving to Philadelphia. I have had a lot of relatives that moved to Philadelphia. I still have relatives there, still there today. They moved when their children were young and for an education and for jobs, and they still make their home there today. And it's just now in the last maybe few years that some of them are beginning to talk about coming back to Virginia. And because your group gets fragmented when a lot of your family moves away, and the only time you see them is maybe once or twice a year. Can you hear me out there? We can hear you. Okay, thank you. But you hold on to what you've got as best you can. And I think that the fact that several of the tribes, the churches of the tribes, we would have old-fashioned homecomings every summer. And we would kind of like stagger it one Sunday, the next Sunday another one, and we would actually gather in any way we could get a ride to go to that homecoming, and we would have the best time because we knew we were accepted, and we had wonderful time. I told someone recently that when you're out in the world and you're doing all of the things that you do every day, you just go along and you just do it. But when you go to one of the other tribes' homes or your own home, and you step your foot on that land, even though you know it's another tribe, it's not yours, but you're on Indian land, and you can say, it's like being at home. Because that's how we grew up. We were always accepted by each other's tribes, and we knew that we were just like, it was just like home. And that sense of acceptance is still there today. And you don't find it anywhere else, that level of acceptance. But we hold on to what we've got as best we can.
Wayne, I'm sorry, Luke.
And we will fight for that.
Yeah.
If we need to.
I wanted to follow up and ask Wayne about this, because Plecker was almost psychotic in his dislike of the Chickahominy. Reading through the papers that have survived of his, he said some awful things about Chickahominy people. Was that sense of internal, but also a sort of pan-Indian sense of support system, was that there for the Chickahominy too?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
I mean, as Chief Bradford said, we support each other, and we're comfortable being around each other. And you asked a question about culture and passing it on. And within our tribe, we always have 1 or 2 or 3 people who are holding on to a lot of the culture and trying to pass it on. So that's one way we keep things going, whether it's someone who knows dance or someone who knows pottery or something like that. So we try to keep those things going and hope that someone in the next generation will pick it up. One thing that you talked about is, we didn't talk about it in whispers. We talked about who we were. We talked about it within our families, within our churches, and all our institutions. So we didn't hide, whisper about who we were. We were proud of it, and we were just told that to be careful about how you go about doing it. But
Right.
I think in one way, Chickahominy in particular, it wasn't intended to be a slap in the face to Plucker, but may have been. In 1951, we started having an annual fall festival and powwow, and we would have that on our site, and that was one day when you could be proud to be Indian and dare anyone to say otherwise. And so
Right.
it started out as a Chickahominy event, and I think it came to the point that every tribe came there and felt like it was their day too. It was Virginia Indian Day for us. It was, for Chickahominy, it was almost like a holiday. The day before the powwow was like a holiday for us. So even though it was never intended to aggravate anyone in particular, it was just a way of us to carry on. I'm sure if Plucker had been around, he would have gone crazy over that. But he did one time in his effort to try to disprove that we were Indians. He came and visited our church one day, and he sat there, and later on he reported, he said, you know, I looked around, looked at everybody there, and I only saw 1 or 2 people who looked like the Western Indians. And so to him, if you didn't look like the Western Indians, you weren't Indian. And so I think that's what he was basing a lot of his theories on. And then, of course, if you look at a lot of the birth records and so forth, a lot of the people didn't know how to read and write when birth records were created, so people who wrote down the race put down what they wanted. And even in the census it was that way. So quite often the information that's in the census is erroneous when it comes to that.
Yeah. I do want to talk about, I'm conscious of time and I want to get to your questions, but I want to briefly talk about records and record keeping. Lou, I know you've got a wonderful story to share, but before we get to your story, I want to open it up to everyone because you've all had experiences with state and federal recognition processes. Did the legacies of the Racial Integrity Act, Plecker's reign of terror, for want of a better way to describe it, how did it impact those efforts for recognition? Perhaps Chief Gray, I'll start with you.
Can you hear me? I think I got it working now. Okay, our tribe, unlike the other 6, we went through the BIA administrative process. A common thought that I hear from people is that the birth certificate not saying Native American affected that. It didn't have such a direct effect because the BIA historians and genealogists were well aware of what occurred in the early 20th century. And it's also the fact that one birth certificate is worthless for a genealogy study. It's the linkage of birth certificates to each other. But the negative effect was what we've been discussing is the hiding, the loss. One of the things that you have to show on recognition is at least every 10 years you have to show documentation that you've existed as a tribe, in like newspaper articles, anything like that. Well, there was numerous decades there in the 20th century where a lot of that history was lost because the tribes just kind of stayed hunkered down and in hiding, losing some of their cultural activity, losing their people, where the diaspora of people going up to Philadelphia and other areas. So it had that secondary effect of making it hard to provide all of that documentation that BIA required.
Lynette, Wayne?
Well, we were state recognized and probably more recent than than the other tribes. We were state recognized in 2010. And luckily, we had documentation going back to the Treaty of 1677, the Treaty of Peace. We also had William Byrd, who wrote about Nottoway people and said we were the copper-colored ones, the mahogany-skinned. So it's very easy to put people who are copper-colored or mahogany-skinned into another racial category. And so that's what we saw when we moved forward, when Nottoway people began to take allotments of their land, of the old reservation land, and that's when we began to see the change on our census records from being listed as Indian to being listed as something else. And so by the time you get to 1924, a lot of the identity has shifted totally because the census records did us in. Plecker did not list Nottoway people in his hit list. We're in the southern part of the state. We're right on the border with North Carolina with the Meherrin. We are Iroquoian people. And so he did not really address Iroquoian people. He stuck with the Algonquin and I believe the Monacan. So we had a little different path to travel. Luckily, we found lots of documents about Nottoway people complaining about our reservation land being taken. And those records, many of them are right here in the library, Virginia. So we were able to track names of people when they had their tribal name and then they shifted to an English name. That was just a wealth of knowledge that helped create our path for state recognition. And then the fact that we lived in communities. Within our area, within our geographic area, there were at least 6 communities of people, all surrounding churches, with cemeteries. And the one document that really kind of helped us tremendously happened to be death records and where people were buried. And when it said Indian cemetery, Indian graveyard, that was how we were able to just track our people through time. And considering we're still living in the same neighborhood, in the same area, close proximity to the reservation land, that was what helped us bring our recognition back as a very, very large and strong tribal entity.
Wayne, how about the Chickahominy there?
Well, as Chief Gray said, Plecker probably didn't necessarily affect federal recognition as much as we thought. It affected our thinking more than anything. We were thinking, well, there's a Racial Integrity Act, and Plecker has changed all these records, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to go with what the records say. And then we found out later that they're more objective than that. The BIA is. They know how these things happen. As Chief Gray said, they knew about us, and I believe it was in the 90s we met with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to talk about federal recognition, and one of them said, "We've been waiting for you. What took you so long?"
Yeah.
And so that's an acknowledgement that they knew who we were. Of course, they couldn't officially say that because that would give us automatic recognition. The one place that I think Plecker did play into federal recognition is in 1934. The Indian Reorganization Act, a federal law, was passed that a lot of what it did was to bring in tribes that had previously not been recognized. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs reached out to the various states, and when they reached out to Virginia, Plecker said, "There's no Indians here."
Yeah.
So theoretically, we probably would have been recognized in 1934 as federal tribes, but because of Plecker's thinking, it didn't happen. And so we enlisted the efforts of Mr. Collier, who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time, and he pretty much said the same thing, that we know these folks are Indian, we know they're the descendants from the original inhabitants, but because of a historical accident, mainly meaning that we didn't have treaties with the United States, so therefore we weren't recognized the way many tribes were. So even he, as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, recognized who we were, but his hands were tied also. So there were several different ways in there that Plecker kept popping up. I was pleased that when we started looking at the administrative route, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs knew about that, and they pretty much discounted a lot of that because they changed their way of thinking. I believe that it wasn't so much what other people thought you were, but what you say you are and who you hold yourself out to the community to be. And that was a big part of the federal recognition, is who do you say you are and how do you live as a community to prove that you're a tribe. And so that was, we went through the legislative process, but we were also putting together an administrative petition at Chickahominy, and we were about ready to wrap it up when we got federal recognition through legislation. So we did a lot of research that was helpful, and we felt pretty positive about what we had done. So we were just about ready to wrap up the first draft, and we were going to meet with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to kind of go over it initially and then fine-tune it some more when we got recognition without going that process.
Now, Plecker did some terrible things, but he didn't get all of the records, which is why I tell my students to get off their phones and get to the archives. And Lou has a cracking story to share with you all about this. Go ahead, Lou.
After our tribe's February tribal meeting, something unique happened. Some folks had from Virginia Tech had come down, and they actually cooked a meal. They cooked some Native American food, and they did some other things in the area, but that was just a normal thing. What happened after that is what's amazing. The week after that, one of the Virginia Tech students named Mason Kaiser, he contacted one of our tribal citizens and asked her if she knew anybody by the name of Mrs. J.L. Adams. And the reason he asked about that was because he had found out that a lot of our tribal members had the last name of Adams. And so and she told him, yes, I know who that is, or was. That's, and I know her grandchildren. She has lots of grandchildren, and I know some of them. And I can connect you with one of them if you'd like. And so she connected him with me. And I met with Mason, and he gave me a picture. He had been doing some research at the Library of Virginia, and he ran across some records by Governor Pollard, who was the governor in 1930. And he ran across this letter written by Mrs. J.L. Adams to Governor Pollard regarding the Racial Integrity Act. And she was asking for help. Anyway, Mason made a picture. He took a picture of the letter with his phone. And then he gave me a copy of the picture that he had taken. But the print was very hard to read, but he had tried to decipher quite a bit of it, and he did, and he gave me that. But I guess it was about a week or so ago, I sent an email to Ashley and asked her, would she get a real copy of that letter for me? That letter was written on January the 20th, 1930, by my grandmother, Molly Adams. And it was like about a 3 or 4 page letter. And she also drew a picture, which the picture was really interesting, because the picture has a man laying down, and it had a young girl laying over top of him. And so in her letter, she says something to the effect, and one of our little Indian girls threw her body on John Smith to save his life. And so we have protected you all these years. And if you could read this letter, it's an amazing letter. And I've been sharing that letter with several of our family members and also our tribal citizens. But it is an amazing letter. And we did not know this letter existed until about 2-3 weeks ago. And Grandma Molly, everybody in their tribe knew Grandma Molly. And the J.L. Adams that she addressed herself in the letter, I guess she did it that way because she figured if she identified her husband, she may have more action than if she had identified herself more as a woman. But because she was a very strong, opinionated woman, and she was always well respected by all of our tribal citizens. And I'm amazed to have a copy of that letter. And I'm going to ask Ashley, and I'll ask her publicly now.
No pressure, Ashley.
If, that's right. But I would hope you would say yes. That letter is a very important document to my family, but it's also a very important document to our tribe. And I would like to, and both Walter Plecker and my grandmother are both deceased. And the letter was written almost 100 years ago now. So I would like to ask if there's any way that the library could see its way of making a copy of the letter for the library's records and provide the actual document to our tribe, because it's such a historical document for our tribe.
Like I said, no pressure, Ashley. I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure you've got questions. So raise your hands, and Ashley's walking around with a microphone. We have some hands down front here. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Stephen Atkins. I have a question for Chief Wayne Atkins. Why do you think Plecker zeroed in on the Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Rappahannock? Do you think it had anything to do with the federal government and the anthropologists to started uncovering names? I just wonder what your feeling is on that.
To me, there's various reasons why he focused on the Chickahominy and I would say the tribes in the Tidewater area. For me, one of the big things was we were identifying ourselves as Indian and we were putting that on the birth records, and so he had access to those names. I think that's where he got a lot of those names from. And the big thing that I didn't know, growing up as a child, I knew about the Racial Integrity Act, I knew about Walter Plecker, but I really just thought it was a one-time thing until I became an adult and realized he was just one person in a big machine. Yeah. He was part of something that was taking place in the state. He had the full support of the state government, all the colleges and universities in Virginia, and then it was worldwide. It wasn't just in Virginia, but when I was growing up, I thought it was just Walter Plecker, and I used to always wonder, how could one man have so much power to do what he's doing? Why does the state allow him to do that? And then as I became an adult, I realized the state was fully behind it. And so I really think he was zeroing in on us because we were standing out and standing up for who we were. And we continued to put our names on the birth certificates and our race as Indian because that's who we were. And so we were challenging him, I think, to prove otherwise. And of course, he did his best to do that. And indeed, he did alter a lot of the birth records that came along, but we continued to put down Indian and allowed him to do what he wanted to with it, because we knew who we were.
He was a bit of a narcissist who didn't like to be wrong. And so, but I believe there was a hand around front here. There it is.
Good evening. Annette Price. Well, you know, talking about specifically the Racial Integrity Act and how it has affected all of our Virginia tribes, and we see that probably now all of our Virginia tribes who are state or federally recognized, aren't you want to be getting behind all of the other tribes coming forward who are seeking recognition and helping those people come along and be recognized as Native American people in the state of Virginia? No, not all of them. See me after the program.
Any more questions?
Could you help us understand what is the advantage to federal recognition as well as state recognition? What does it mean to you and to all of us? What's the benefit?
It means that our government, our federal government, finally recognizes us as who we really are, that we are Indians. We were here when the Europeans came to this country. We're still here, and we're going to stay here. And because prior to federal recognition, our own country did not fully recognize us for who we truly are. And we had to fight long and hard for it. Because I know that Steve Adkins, Wayne Adkins, my brother Ken, who's out there in the audience, I know they worked for it, worked on that for 20 plus years before we achieved it. But that was not the beginning of trying to achieve that, because my grandparents worked toward it years before. And they would be proud of those that worked for it and finally achieved it today. But it was a long, hard fight. And the tribes, the 6 tribes that got federal recognition in 2018, they looked out for each other. The individuals that worked actually did the work behind the scenes. And one thing that comes to my mind, and I was reading it not too long ago, the bill, of course, was named after Thomasina Jordan. And I read, not just a few weeks ago, about a week before she passed away, is that she testified, was either in the House of Representatives or the Senate. And this was a week before she passed away, because she had been ill for some time. And it was a long, hard fight by all of the tribes that were involved in it. And I commend all of those individuals that fought so long for it, because without them, it wouldn't have happened.
Let me talk about state recognition, because state recognition, what we wanted was just to be identified and acknowledged for who we are. State recognition gives us 2 things: identity, okay, or maybe 3, but the benefit of it, we can now fish in fresh water without paying for a fishing license, and we can go hunting without paying for a hunting license. That's it. So it's all about acknowledging who we are.
And one thing I would add also is that some of my family members, some of my siblings, their birth records were changed, and my parents had to get them changed back to Indian.
Sir, go ahead.
I will have to apologize for my ignorance on all of this. I can understand why back in 1920 and 1930, the state of Virginia may have wanted to erase your identity as Native Americans. What I don't understand is, what did they want you to be instead? Because I can't imagine that they wanted you to be white. So how did they want you, what did they want you to put on your birth certificates instead of Indian?
According to Walter Plecker, there were 2 races in Virginia: white and colored.
white and everybody else.
White and everybody else. Everybody else lumped together in one other race.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ramona Chapman, and I wanted to ask Chief Alston, why do you think you all haven't gained that federal recognition as yet, the Nottoway of Virginia? And is there anything that we can do to help your tribe gain that federal recognition? And also, is there African ancestry in any of your tribes? Thank you.
Well, in our petition letter that went with our information in the beginning, we stated we do not deny any of our ancestors, but our first ancestors were Nottoway people. Everybody else just came along and joined in. So we are interested in federal recognition, but as you've probably heard from here, it's a very expensive process. And it's a time-consuming process. So our focus in the beginning has simply been on educating people as to who we are, because we were left out of the history books. We have strong documentation from the General Assembly and going back through centuries, but we were left out of the history books. And so that was our first step, is just education. Now, yes, we would love to have federal recognition, but it's, again, time and money. And I think you all will attest to it's time and money, right? Okay.
And it took the 6 tribes from, wasn't it 1983 when we achieved state recognition, until 2018 to achieve federal recognition.
It's a grueling process.
It is a long, grueling process.
I'm Richard Bland, live in Richmond. I live behind John Powell's home. John Powell married Louise Burley. It was actually the woman, Louise Burley's home. So I've had interest in the Racial Integrity Act. One book that I really care for deeply is a book called Indian Island. It's about the Monacan tribe in Amherst County. Anyone look online, Indian Island, and you'll find a very fine book that documents their pathway through from the time of Plucker losing their identity in the 1960s, not even realizing that they were tribal, except that if they were to go to a hospital in Lynchburg, Virginia, they would not be admitted. They were considered issues, weren't even considered human, considered issues. It's an interesting book. I'm a little interested in any further documentation, publications that come available now in the future for documenting your tribal experience. I would encourage it very highly. Thank you.
I think that's something we talk about a lot, is we need to document ourselves because we're living history right now, but to us it's just living. But it is history eventually for generations to come later. So what you're saying is something all tribes should be considering. I'm not sure any of us really have the time yet or the expertise. It almost would have to take a dedicated person. That's all they were going to do. And we've been doing some of that. I say the Chickahominy has been doing that, and I think other tribes have also been doing that, collecting oral histories from some of the older people. Particularly in our tribe, it seems like so many of the elders are passing away recently that we're losing a lot of that knowledge and that cultural connection that we used to have.
We do have a younger population interested in reclaiming the language. And we're fortunate that we had word list that Thomas Jefferson collected. And so from those word lists, we're able to reestablish and develop a working language. But again, I'll say it's the young people the ones, you know, I'm not into remembering a new language. because, but I'm grateful for our young folks who are really doing a good job in reestablishing the language.
Yeah, I would add a lot of the Algonquin tribes are part of a group for language revitalization. I actually just yesterday got some recorded messages that I could learn myself how to introduce myself. I haven't had a real chance to look at it. I was surprised that somebody from Mattaponi, they recorded. I'm Chief Gray, the gray hair one. I didn't know how to do that, but it's something I want to look through those. But it's also artwork. A lot of our young tribal citizens are re-engaging with pottery making and other forms of art. And I'll throw in a little pitch. We have a little exhibit down on, no, actually up that way, up toward Belvedere. What's the brick house? There's a art show of Pamunkey artisans there. So if anyone's interested, what is it? Vessel. Okay.
Vesseled.
Vesseled.
Okay. But is that the brick house? Just before you hit Belvedere on this side of Broad. So little pitch there.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to just make one statement to make folks understand how difficult it is to go through this process. We were awarded an ANA grant in the mid-teens of the 21st century. And Wayne Atkins' full-time job, he retired from Philip Morris, his full-time job was to be the director of that grant. And the grant was solely focused on our petition for administrative recognition. So we had a dual process which began in the 80s. In earnest, in around 1996, a technical team from BIE came down and we met in a church basement and went over several of the documents that we had amassed to that point. But we had a dual process until we gained federal recognition. It culminated in the middle of January 2018 when we went before Lee Fleming, Office of Federal Acknowledgement, and he looked at the package we had and asked some very probative questions for clarity. And he goofed up several times and saying, you know, I told you the Chickahominy tribe could gain federal recognition, and, you know, the work you've done, you know, substantiates that. He didn't say we had it, but we knew administrative recognition could still be in that stage where people could challenge it for a long period of time, as they challenged Pamunkey and delayed it, but ultimately they prevailed. So what we told the Office of Federal Acknowledgement is whichever route hits first is the one we'll take. And it turned out the Senate signed the bill mid-January. It went to the President, and he signed it January 29th, 2018 at about 6:45 p.m. If it had gone on till 11:59 and he had done nothing, 2018, if he would have done nothing, we would have gained federal recognition. A lot of folks don't understand that. It's called a pocket veto. But we would have gained federal recognition without his signature. But the point I want to emphasize is several of the tribes, we're doing a dual process, repeatedly going to the BIA, sitting down in the Office of Federal Acknowledgement and going over our records and going back and refining and coming again while preparing testimony for federal recognition to both houses of Congress. In the past, 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate supported our bill, and we gained federal acknowledgement. But a lot of folks don't realize that these 6 tribes were building petitions for federal recognition, the administrative process, while we were going through the other one. So, and Wayne, as I said, 40 hours a week working on this. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you for that.
Spent a lot of time in this building doing research and also researching our tribal records that we have. We have tribal minutes that go back to 1901, and of going through those. Of course, I wasn't working by myself. We had a team of people that were doing it, but it was very fulfilling to be able to do that.
One of the things that Walter Plecker attempted to do for the Virginia Indians was to commit paper genocide, to erase who you are as a person. Think about that.
But his records redounded to our benefit, because there was a movie list that anthropologists had put together, and his list approximated that list. So what he thought he was doing to destroy us actually bolstered our case for federal recognition. But I'd like a plug for the library. I love the Library of Virginia.
We are over time, and Ashley's starting to give me the evil eye, so I'm gonna, if she permits, one last question.
My question is to, I'm a member of the Saponi tribe, which is a tribe of Virginia and North Carolina Indians. Plecker attacked us. Our name is on the list downstairs. I'm an Epps, and this is my nephew, and he's a Martin, but we're related. And I found out about this by accident, and I do not understand how y'all, fellow Virginia people, Indians, we were recognized by Virginia because Virginia sent their Indian children to our North Carolina school. Right. And I just feel, if y'all don't see it, maybe I'm looking the wrong way, but I see y'all as continuing to erase my Indian, to not be included in y'all's events, to not be just noticed of it. You know, I had just, like I said, I found out this by accident, and I was just wondering, am I wrong in my feelings that y'all aren't continuing his erasing of my Indian identity as a Virginia Indian?
Well, I can't speak for the panelists. I can only speak to the scholarship that I do and the teaching that I do, and reassure you that my students do learn about your tribal history.
Well, I've never been asked, or anyone in our tribe that I know of been asked to come and speak. Would that be inclusive? I think so, because I go all over North Carolina and South Carolina, and to tell our Saponi story and to
well,
share quilting
I appreciate
events.
that, and I'll keep that in mind going forward.
Great. I'm going to give Ashley my contact information, and Miss Batson, she's going to have it also, so y'all won't have to dig far to find us.
Thank you.
Say on behalf of the Chickahominy tribe, we're not purposely excluding anybody. We're not excluding your tribe at all. I have friends from your tribe, very good friends. Right, so I'm not sure why you say we're excluding you.
Maybe just in some of the more official ways.
Okay. Okay.
Thank y'all for listening.
I have one little thing for this conversation. I want to go back and talk a little bit about education, if I can. My name is Ken Adams. I'm the former chief of the Upper Mattaponi. I want to talk about education a little bit. It's a big subject in Virginia, but just going back a little bit in past years, my sister Lou sitting up here talking about going to going to Oak Hill Academy in Western Virginia to get a high school diploma. Every single one of my older brothers and sisters, I have 9 brothers and sisters. I had 9, and every single one of my older brothers and sisters had to go away from home to get a high school diploma in the state of Virginia. Many of them 3 went to Oklahoma, 2 went to Michigan, lived with families they didn't know. I saw my brother Howard this afternoon. He went to live with a family in Michigan when he was 14 years old. When he was 14 years old, 600-700 miles away from home, just to get an education in his state. Just to get an education. I was the first, along with one other person, to graduate from King William High School in 1965. In King William County, there are 3 tribes: Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Upper Mattaponi. I was the first, along with one other, to graduate from high school in King William County in a public school, 1965. Those stories about education are still harming us today, still harming us today. I didn't live with my brothers and sisters that were much older than I. When I went to visit them when I was in my 20s, it was like going into the house of a stranger. I didn't know them. I didn't know them, my own family, because of people like Walter Plecker.
Thank you. I would just like to thank you all for your comments and questions. Lou, I think you wanted to have the last word.
I have just one thing I would like to extend to everybody here over Memorial Day weekend, the 26th and the 25th. The Upper Mattaponi tribe will be having our annual powwow in King William County on our tribal grounds. You're all invited to come and participate. I can promise you, if you come, you'll have a great time. You'll hear the drums beat and the dancers dance, and see the dancers dance. And if you stick around, you may be invited into the ring to dance with them. So come and join us.
Well, I'd like to thank you all again for being here this evening. Thank our panelists for a wonderfully engaging and moving conversation. Can we put our hands together one more time?